Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, you can point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. For this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Dave Gustafson of the International Life Sciences Institute. His work is focused on the ways that climate change affects agriculture, and the article we're discussing today is the product of a workshop on that topic that was held at Washington University in St. Louis. In the article, Dr. Gustafson and his colleagues call for an agricultural field research network in the U.S. Midwest. The major aim of that network would be to pool knowledge and develop techniques to address the effects of climate change and prevent large-scale grain failures, which, as he explains, are a very real possibility in the not-too-distant future. So let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Gustafson, thank you very much for joining me. Before we talk more about the agricultural research network you propose, I was hoping you could give us a little bit of background on the threats that are faced by Midwest agriculture, be those from climate change or other sources.
Well, climate change is obviously one of the growing threats to our Midwest agricultural system. I would say it's perhaps the biggest one, but it's not the only one. We also have some other issues to deal with, such as increasing demand for food, and especially more nutritious food. And our world food system is currently delivering enough calories to feed everyone, but is not necessarily delivering, the right mix of nutrients to keep everyone healthy. And so that's one of the other big challenges. But for sure, especially here in the U.S. Midwest, I would say climate change is probably the single biggest threat, and especially in the form of more extreme events. And in fact, here in St. Louis, where I happen to live, we've just experienced a historic, unprecedented flood, in part due to El Nino, but scientists believe it was probably, in fact, worsened by the impacts of ongoing climate change.
And one of the things that struck me was that in practical terms, that seems to result in a large degree of variability in potential yields. I think you said a figure of either negligible effects for corn yields or up to as much as a 60% decline. What accounts for that?
Well, yeah, and just one clarification, which is a very important clarification, which is that that range that you just quoted assumes the use of today's corn varieties, which obviously have been adapted to current climate conditions. And in the future, presumably, there will be continuing advances in breeding that will make it possible to offset some of those yield impacts. But if we were to plant today's varieties in that future climate of the year 2050, we would experience that range of possible results as indicated in the paper. And as you say, it could be fairly small effects to as much as 50 or 60% reduction in yields. And that there are many sources of uncertainty there for that particular impact. One of which is the uncertainty in climate. As I have already mentioned, we're not exactly sure what the changes in temperature and precipitation are going to be. We know that there's certain trends, but we don't know that with precision. But just as important in this case are uncertainties introduced by the crop models themselves. We have to use, currently anyway, computer-based simulation tools to try to understand how corn plants will survive in a different climate in the future. But those models actually predict significantly different results depending on the particular rainfall and precipitation patterns that rainfall temperature and precipitation patterns that we experience. And so those multiple sources of uncertainty end up giving you that fairly wide range of impacts.
And you propose an integrated field research network to address some of that uncertainty. And I was hoping you could give us a skeletal outline of, what are the things involved in creating such a network? Is it a public effort? Is it a public-private partnership? Who are the major players, and what does the final product look like?
Well, and that actually was the essence of our paper. We believe that these changes are coming. We know for sure that changes are coming, but we don't know precisely how severe they're going to be and what the nature of those changes are going to be in terms of, for instance, increased pests and disease threats to corn in Illinois and elsewhere throughout the Midwest. And obviously the U.S. Midwest is a really, really important source of grains like corn and soybeans, and to some extent wheat, for not just the U.S. Agri-food system, but for the world. And because of its importance globally, and because we believe that we already have a pretty solid infrastructure in place for monitoring and improving corn and soybeans here in the U.S., we think that this would be the perfect place to set up what we describe as an integrated field research network for monitoring ongoing changes and testing adaptation strategies in the real world as these changes take place. And in terms of who would be involved, many of the players that we talk about in the paper are already doing a lot of work in this area. And USDA in particular has had a very active agricultural field research program now going back, literally probably a century, but certainly over the past several decades. They've had a very active program in terms of monitoring and improving agricultural systems. And we know that the land-grant universities, in part with support from USDA and others, have their own research sites sprinkled across the U.S. Midwest and elsewhere. And then the private sector, farmers themselves, but also the major industry providers such as Pioneer and Monsanto and the other major companies that have been involved with improving corn and soybean varieties, have a very large network of their own of research sites. However, currently, these are not integrated, and we're not able to take all of the information that's coming from these research sites and pool them using tools such as those that have been developed to analyze big data, to actually monitor what's happening in terms of, for instance, pest and disease movement across the Midwest, to monitor the direct impact of the flooding events that I described earlier, as well as high temperatures, which have a very negative impact on yield, especially if they come at particular times for corn in particular, but also soybeans to some extent.
So it sounds from your description like the problem may be less of one of, data gathering. There are a lot of organizations already doing that, and more one of, achieving data interoperability and, getting the various organizations to pool those resources and to make some sense of them kind of all together.
That's exactly right. And there's, we call this open data, and there's been quite a large movement toward open data in many other domains. For instance, in the genomic area of science, a number of open data portals have been assembled for that purpose. And we're starting to see efforts such as one that's been organized in part by the U.S. government called GODAN, which is the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative, that was launched a couple of years ago, where a number of governments and other entities have come together and are promoting the concept of open data when it comes to ag and nutrition. But we're not actually seeing it practiced as much as it could and should be in order to provide everyone within the agri-food system with all the information they need to really understand what the challenges are today and what they're likely to be in the future. And then as experiments, field experiments in particular, are conducted to explore different adaptation responses, those results from those field studies ought to be reported up into an open, interoperable network among public and private sector partners to actually inform and implement better practices for improving our response to climate change.
That's a great overview. And moving to the practical side of things a little bit, in your article you touch on 4 areas where a network such as the one you described might make contributions. And the first of those was improving crops. And I was just hoping you could describe a little bit what that means. So
as we highlight in the paper, our crops have a tremendous potential to overcome the impacts of climate change. And we have lots of empirical evidence for that. We know that climate change is already increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns here in the U.S. Midwest. But we also know that we've been continuing to see yield gain in these crops despite those changes. And so that's obviously direct evidence that the crops have the potential to overcome the sorts of changes that we've already seen. However, we really don't know enough about this natural variation and how these crops are going to respond to additional both abiotic impacts such as ozone, higher temperature, as well as biotic factors, biological challenges to the crops, including pests and disease. And we also don't know how climate change will impact the nutritional content of the crops, because crops such as we grow here in the U.S. Midwest are in fact very, very important sources for many micronutrients and other factors that are present in our food system that are essential for human health. And so this is one of the areas that we highlight that would be important for improving crops in the field. But there are, in fact, additional areas that can be explored through the sort of an integrated field research network that we've proposed, such as some of the more advanced molecular tools, things like RNAi, the ability to up and down regulate genes, and in fact, further studies of a really important factor that's been underappreciated up until now, which is the microbiome. And in particular, the microbiome that's present within the soil, which probably is yet another source of potential improvements to making plants better able to respond in a positive way to the impacts of climate change. The soil interacts with plants in a very specific way, especially with regard to moisture stress. And this is for sure another fruitful area of research that could feed up into the network and make it possible to better adapt to climate change.
Okay, and moving along, what kind of effects would you expect the research network to have in adapting to, pest and disease threats? You touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah, we absolutely know that pests and disease are on the move throughout the U.S. Midwest, but also elsewhere throughout the world, in part due to climate change. And we've had some tropical diseases that have been identified originally in Brazil, for instance, the soybean rust that could move into the U.S. Midwest, and the network could be a great place to monitor for the movement of those pests and diseases as they come into new areas of the Midwest. And we could be integrating field test sites where we're monitoring the ability of specific control measures to control those pests and disease, and feed them up into a network that then allows us to track the movement of those pests, and also test particular methods of control that could be used to minimize their impact.
And moving along, you also talk about sustainable agricultural practices, and I'm wondering about the role of the research network in promoting those.
Yes. One of the things that's been recognized, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere, is that there's a whole suite of practices which are now generally described as climate-smart agricultural practices that could be employed to help not only respond to the impacts of climate change, but in some cases actually mitigate future releases of greenhouse gases, especially efforts to trap carbon dioxide in the soil profile, build up soil carbon, which obviously helps to mitigate future climate change, but in fact also creates a plant soil system that is more resilient to the impact of climate change.
Okay, and the last thing you touched on was deploying innovative IT capabilities. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, that there's a data problem where you have a lot of data from a lot of different sources. So obviously data curation and data integration is going to be a big part of this. But are there other concerns as well?
Absolutely. We see that there's an explosion that we've all experienced in our personal lives of IT capabilities. We can hardly live without our iPhones and our Androids and our other personal IT devices. We've seen this happen and have impacts in agriculture as well. And for sure, for anybody who's seen the inside of a modern U.S. farm tractor, you know that it's covered with computer screens and equipped with a wide array of IT devices that make it possible for the farmer to utilize an incredible amount of information that's coming in through GPS, geographic information systems, and other approaches for making it possible for the farmer to actually manage his or her field on a not a per, even a per acre basis, but a per square meter basis to plant specific varieties in specific portions of fields, possibly even varying the plant population, and therefore making it possible to really optimize plant production on a very specific basis. And as we are seeing farmers do that, we're not only utilizing a lot of data, but we're generating a tremendous amount of data through collection on tractors and other devices as they go, planters as they go through the field. And those data, it is believed, ought to be made available in an appropriate way as open data in order to make it possible for all of the advances that we've seen in the IT world on big data analytical capabilities to help from an overall system perspective advance farming and responses to climate change. Another potential source of data, which is a bit controversial, but for sure is likely to come more and more in the future, is the use of drones to collect data. We already have a tremendous amount of data collection that takes place through satellites and airplanes, but unmanned vehicles are for sure going to be an additional source of data that individual farmers will want to use, but there could be, and we argue in the paper should be, protocols established such that properly anonymized data can be pooled and used in a big data approach to help better inform approaches to adapting to climate change. We think the challenge is significant enough that there ought to be a workable solution here, a consensus around getting over some of the privacy issues and realizing that we quite literally are all in this together, and we need to be finding ways to use these huge potential sources of data in ways that can better inform adaptation responses.
Right. And we've spoken so far mostly about the U.S. Midwest, and that is the focus of the article. But do these ideas and will the results of this research network have applicability outside of that, in other parts of the world?
The topic of this particular paper was the U.S. Midwest, largely because when we originally convened back in September 2014 at Washington University, that was the topic at hand, which was climate change and its impact on the U.S. Midwest. However, we believe that the sorts of innovations and advances that can be researched here in the Midwest are, in fact, or would be directly applicable to many other areas around the world. And not only areas that experience similar climates. We know that there are today systems, for instance, especially in South America, in both Brazil and Argentina, that are quite similar in terms of the scale of operations, and they're using the same degree of mechanization, and in some cases are seeing crop yields that are as high and possibly even higher under more favorable climate conditions than we are able to get here in the U.S. And looking over to Europe, we know that, for instance, corn yields in much of Central and Southern Europe are very similar to what we see here in the U.S. So the approaches that we research here through the network and the innovations that in big data, the use of that, the new sustainable ag practices, the advances in new crop varieties, all of these should have direct applicability to other parts of the world, including areas such as China, South Asia, and perhaps even sub-Saharan Africa, where we know that there are active breeding efforts today. China is the number 2 producer of corn, for instance, and there's huge opportunities to improve productivity in a country like that. And we absolutely believe that the types of innovations that we could develop through the network would have application to those other world areas.
And just to close it out, I was hoping you could give us an idea of, where things stand today and what the next steps for getting this research network underway actually will be.
Well, we're seeing pretty good yields for corn and soybeans now, but it's not too far in the future where we would expect to see climate change to really start to have very negative impacts on these crops, and that we need to take action now to prepare for that. And so the convening of a larger workshop to begin planning the particular actions that are necessary to implement the recommendations in our paper is what we believe is the logical next step, and we're hoping to bring those parties together possibly in September of this year here in St. Louis.
And we will definitely look forward to reading about the results. Dr. Gustafson, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to join you, and really appreciate the fact that Bioscience chose to include this our paper in your publication and even featured on the cover. That was very much appreciated.
It was our pleasure. Thanks again, Dr. Gustafson. And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. Check the links below to read the article, and feel free to leave us a comment or send us a message on Twitter. Talk to you next time.